Wood smoke and stale sweat clung to the heavy wool of Harlan's coat as he watched the stagecoach rattle to a halt. The bitter wind off the ridge bit through his beard. He'd paid 10 ounces of gold for a wife. He hadn't expected the town's cruelest joke to step out. The mud of Red Creek was a living thing. It sucked at the soles of Harlan's boots, thick and freezing, as the stagecoach driver threw the iron brake. The horses stood lathered in sweat, their breath pluming in the twilight like steam from a locomotive. Harlan stood on the warped wooden slats of the depot, a solitary figure carved from calluses and bad decisions. He smelled of pine pitch, raw tobacco, and the blood of the deer he'd dressed 2 mornings ago. He had expected a woman worn thin by the world. That was what the letter from the agency had promised. A sturdy, capable widow, eager for the isolation of the high timberline. He needed hands to help skin the traps, legs to haul water when the creek froze, and maybe, just maybe, a quiet presence to keep the profound, crushing silence of the mountain from driving him completely mad. The coach door whined open. A heavy-booted foot stepped onto the iron runner. The coach shifted, groaning under a sudden redistribution of weight. Then, she stepped down into the mud. Harlan's jaw tightened, the muscles ticking beneath his graying beard. The woman who stood before him was massive. She wore a drab, slate-colored dress that looked less tailored and more constructed. Yards of heavy wool draped over a frame that was unarguably obese. A thick woolen shawl swallowed her shoulders. Her face, beneath the brim of a severely plain bonnet, was round, flushed bright pink from the cold, and slicked with a thin sheen of nervous sweat, despite the biting wind. Behind Harlan, on the porch of the general store, a low chuckle drifted over the wind. It was Miller, the assayer, muttering something to his clerk. Harlan didn't need to hear the words. The town despised him, a solitary, volatile mountain man who only came down to trade pelts and buy whiskey. They had probably seen the passenger manifest. They had probably waited all afternoon just to watch his face. Anger, hot and unreasonable, flashed in Harlan's chest. It wasn't heroics that surged through him. It was deep, ugly resentment. He had paid for a partner in survival. This woman looked as though the sheer effort of breathing the thin, high-altitude air was going to kill her before they even reached the tree line. "You, Harlan?" she asked. Her voice was surprisingly soft, a stark contrast to her imposing size. It carried a slight rasp, like dry leaves scraping over stone. "I am," he grunted. He didn't offer his hand. He looked at the leather trunk the driver dragged out of the boot. It was enormous, scarred with deep gouges, strapped with thick leather belts. "That's mine," she said, her chest heaving slightly as she spoke. She smelled faintly of lye soap, stale peppermint, and the distinct sour odor of a long, anxious journey. "Looks heavy," he muttered. "It is." Harlan stepped off the boardwalk, the mud sucking at his boots. He grabbed the iron handles of the trunk. He expected a struggle, but as he heaved it upward, the sheer, dead weight of it nearly tore the rotator cuff in his right shoulder. It felt like it was packed with iron ingots. He let out a low curse, dragging it toward his buckboard wagon. He didn't look back to see if she was following. The ride up the mountain was agonizing. The wagon wheels shrieked against the rocky, uneven trail, a high, rhythmic whine that drilled into Harlan's skull. Beside him, on the splintered wooden bench, the woman Sadie, the letter had said her name was Sadie, sat entirely immobile. She took up more than half the seat. Harlan found himself pressed against the cold iron railing, the side of his thigh brushing against the dense, heavy wool of her skirts. Every time the wagon hit a rut, her mass shifted, pressing into him. He hated the proximity. He hated the way she breathed, a shallow, rhythmic wheeze that told him her lungs were fighting the altitude. "She won't last a month," he thought, his hands white-knuckling the leather reins. "First heavy snow, she'll catch pneumonia, or she'll break an ankle slipping on the ice, and I'll have to put her down like a lame horse." He was a pragmatic man. The mountain didn't forgive weakness. It didn't care about a person's feelings or their past. It only cared about calories, heat, and leverage. This woman had none of the traits required for survival here. "It's getting colder," Sadie said quietly, about 2 hours into the ascent. The sun had dipped below the jagged teeth of the western ridge, plunging the trail into a deep, bruised purple dusk. "Does that up here?" Harlan replied, his voice flat. She didn't speak again. She just pulled the gray shawl tighter around her throat, her thick, ungloved hands trembling slightly in the dropping temperature. Harlan noticed her hands. They were large, the knuckles swollen, but the skin was strangely smooth, not the cracked, calloused hands of a woman who had worked the land. He felt a sudden, sharp pang of guilt for his own cruelty, which he immediately shoved down. He couldn't afford pity. Pity was a luxury for men who lived in towns with doctors and mercantile stores. Up here, pity got you killed. The cabin appeared through the dense stand of Douglas firs, like a rotting tooth jutting out of the hillside. It was a single room of rough-hewn logs, chinked with dried mud and horsehair. The roof was pitched steep to shed the snow, covered in overlapping cedar shakes that rattled in the wind. Harlan pulled the mule to a halt. He wrapped the reins around the brake lever and jumped down. His knees popped in the cold air. He walked to the back of the wagon and began unlacing the canvas tarp over his supplies. He didn't offer to help her down. It was a test, petty and small. He watched her out of the corner of his eye. Sadie shuffled to the edge of the wagon box. She looked down at the ground, a 4-foot drop that might as well have been a canyon. She gripped the wooden sideboards. Her knuckles went white. Slowly, clumsily, she turned herself around, lowering her heavy body backward. Her boot searched for the iron step, missed, and she slipped. She hit the frozen earth with a heavy, muted thud, landing hard on her hip. Harlan flinched. He took half a step toward her, but stopped. Sadie didn't cry out. She didn't ask for help. She simply sat in the freezing dirt for a long, terrible moment, her breath coming in ragged white plumes. Then, bracing her hands against the muddy wheel spokes, she pushed herself up. She dusted off her skirt with deliberate, agonizing slowness, her face pale beneath the flush of the cold. "Ground's hard," was all she said. Harlan swallowed the dry lump in his throat. "Door's unlocked. Go inside. I'll see to the mule." When Harlan finally entered the cabin, carrying her impossibly heavy trunk, the space immediately felt suffocating. The cabin was built for one man. His solitary existence was mapped in the worn floorboards between the iron stove, the single chair, and the narrow bed in the corner. Sadie stood near the center of the room, still wrapped in her shawl, looking massive and entirely out of place. The air smelled of old ash, rendered bare fat, and the metallic tang of dried blood from the pelts stacked in the corner. "Sit," Harlan said, dropping the trunk at the foot of the bed. The floorboards groaned. Sadie moved to the wooden chair by the table. As she sat, the chair let out a sharp, perilous creak. She froze, her weight hovering in a half-crouch, terrified of breaking his furniture. Slowly, she let her full weight settle. The chair held, but barely. Harlan set to building a fire. He moved with practiced efficiency, shaving kindling with his hunting knife, striking the flint, blowing the tiny orange spark into a roaring flame. The heat radiated outward, slowly pushing the bitter cold back into the corners of the room. He cooked dinner in silence. Salted pork, fried in its own grease, and a tin of beans heated over the stove. He scooped the heavy, unappetizing mess onto 2 tin plates. He set one in front of her, alongside a cracked mug of black coffee. He sat on a wooden crate opposite her, cutting his meat with his pocket knife. He expected her to eat ravenously. It was a cruel assumption, born of his own biases regarding her size. But as he watched her, the contradiction jarred him. Sadie ate with painful slowness. She held the tin fork delicately between her thick fingers. She took microscopic bites, chewing thoroughly, her eyes fixed entirely on the rusted surface of the stove. She didn't look at him. She barely made a sound, save for the slight wheeze in her chest. She ate perhaps a quarter of the food on her plate before laying her fork down. "Not hungry?" Harlan asked, his tone rough. "My stomach is unsettled from the journey," she murmured. "You need to eat to stay warm up here. Fat burns fast." He regretted the word times fat times the second it left his mouth. It hung in the air, heavy and blunt. Sadie didn't flinch. She simply nodded. "I will manage." The hours dragged on. The wind outside began to howl, a low, mournful sound that rattled the window panes. Harlan drank 2 fingers of cheap rye whiskey from a glass jar. The alcohol burned its way down to his stomach, but it did nothing to take the edge off the suffocating tension in the room. He had bought a wife. The arrangement implied certain things. It implied a shared bed. It implied touch. As he looked at her, sitting rigidly in the chair, staring into the fire. A profound sense of dread washed over him. He felt repulsed, not just by her sheer physical size, but by the utter foreignness of her in his sanctuary. Yet, beneath the repulsion, a darker, self-loathing voice mocked him. "Look at you," it whispered. "You're a half-feral old man with a missing finger and a soul rotting from isolation. Who are you to judge?" He drained the jar and set it on the table with a clack. "Time to turn in," he said. His voice sounded loud, almost violent in the quiet cabin. "Fire won't hold the heat past midnight." Sadie's head snapped up. Her eyes, pale blue and rimmed with exhaustion, widened slightly. She looked toward the narrow bed, then back to him. "I can sleep on the floor," she said quietly, "near the stove." "You'll freeze to the boards," Harlan snapped, patience wearing thin. "Bed's big enough if we don't move around. Just get yourself ready." He turned his back to her, unbuckling his gun belt and draping it over the chair. He unlaced his heavy boots, the leather stiff with cold. Every sound in the cabin was suddenly magnified. The crack of a pine knot in the fire, the howl of the wind, and then the sound of heavy wool sliding against wool. Harlan stood by the wash basin, splashing freezing water on his face, trying to block out the sounds behind him. He heard the metallic clink of a brass button hitting the floorboards. He heard her breath, hitching slightly, a sharp intake of air that sounded like pain. "Damn it," she whispered. It was the first time she had shown any real emotion. It was a choked, desperate sound. Harlan turned around, an irritated reprimand on his tongue. "What's the prob?" The words died in his throat. Sadie was standing by the bed. She had managed to unfasten the front of her heavy gray dress, letting the bodice slip down. The thick shawl was pooled at her feet. She was wearing a rough canvas chemise beneath it, but the back of the garment was unlaced, hanging loose around her heavy shoulders. She was turned slightly away from him, reaching awkwardly over her shoulder, trying to untangle a knotted leather thong that held the chemise together. But it wasn't the struggle that froze the blood in Harlan's veins. It was the skin exposed beneath the canvas. From the base of her neck, disappearing down into the heavy folds of her garments, Sadie's back was not smooth skin. It was a horrific, deeply entrenched landscape of violence. Thick, ropey masses of scar tissue, shiny and pale, ridged her flesh in jagged, intersecting lines. Some of the scars were wide, flat planes of melted skin, white and tight. Others were raised and purple, twisting over her shoulder blades like ivy choking a tree. It was the unmistakable, catastrophic damage of fire. Severe, unyielding fire. Harlan forgot how to breathe. The glass dropped from his hand, hitting the floorboards, but mercifully not shattering. Sadie gasped at the sound and immediately wrenched the canvas up, pulling it tight against her neck, hunching her shoulders inward. She didn't turn around. Her massive frame began to shake, a violent, silent tremor that shook the floorboards beneath her. Harlan started, his voice a pathetic, gravelly whisper. The cynical shell he had built around himself cracked straight down the middle. He stared at the woman he had spent the last 6 hours silently despising for her weakness, suddenly realizing he was standing in the presence of someone who had survived a hell he couldn't even fathom. Harlan's boots felt rooted to the floorboards. The wind screamed around the eaves of the cabin, but inside, the silence was a physical pressure pressing against his eardrums. Sadie remained hunched, her thick shoulders drawn up to her ears. She was a monument of defensive posture. The canvas chemise was still bunched at her throat, her back exposed to the cold air of the room and the harsh, judging light of the oil lamp. She was waiting for the inevitable, the disgust, the harsh words, the demand for a refund from the mail-order agency. She had heard it all before, felt the revulsion radiating from the doctors, the nurses, the men on the street. Harlan took a step forward. His knee cracked. He moved clumsily, a man unaccustomed to navigating anything more delicate than a bear trap. "Leave it," he rasped. His voice was hoarse, stripped of its previous hostility. He closed the distance between them. Sadie flinched, a violent, involuntary jerk of her massive frame, as his shadow fell over her. Harlan stopped, his hands hovering awkwardly in the air. His right hand was missing its index finger, a careless moment with a frozen logging chain 5 years ago. He had thought that Stump made him maimed. He had thought his self-imposed exile made him a hardened survivor. Looking at the catastrophic terrain of Sadie's flesh, his own pain felt cheap, insignificant. "Your hands are shaking," he said quietly. "Let me get the knot." He didn't wait for her permission. He couldn't. If he hesitated, the crushing weight of the situation would paralyze him. He reached out, his thick, calloused fingers brushing against the nape of her neck. Her skin was fever hot. The texture of the scars beneath his knuckles was horrifyingly rigid, like melted wax poured over corded rope, devoid of the natural elasticity of human skin. He worked the stiff leather thong, his clumsy fingers fighting the tight knot she had created in her panic. Sadie held her breath. Her chest didn't move. "St. Louis," she whispered. The words sounded like they were dragged over broken glass. Harlan paused, then went back to working the knot. "What?" "The industrial laundry on Clark Avenue, 4 years ago." She stared straight ahead at the frosted window pane. One of the pressurized steam boilers cracked. Then it blew. "I was working the mangles right behind it." The knot gave way. Harlan pulled the leather thong loose, but he didn't step back immediately. He stood there, the smell of her sweat and the faint, medicinal odor of old liniment filling his nose. "I didn't burn to death," she continued, her voice flat, utterly devoid of the self-pity Harlan despised in townfolk. "The steam cooked the skin, the lye from the vats did the rest. They put me in the charity ward at St. Vincent's." The skin tightened as it healed, contracted, pulled my shoulders forward, locked up the fascia in my lower back and legs. Every time I tried to stand, the scar tissue tore. Harlan dropped his hands to his sides. He took a slow step back, giving her space. Sadie pulled the canvas chemist tight around her shoulders, covering the devastation. She finally turned to look at him. Her pale blue eyes were dry. There were no tears, just a stark, exhausted resignation. "I laid in that charity bed for 2 years, Harlan. They fed me porridge and boiled potatoes to keep me alive, but I couldn't move. The weight came on, and the heavier I got, the harder it was to walk. When the hospital finally discharged me, no one would hire a crippled, fat woman who couldn't lift a wash bucket." She gestured down at her massive, wool-draped body. "This isn't gluttony, it's gravity, and it's survival. The agency was my last stop before the city workhouse. I knew if I went there, I'd be dead in a week." Harlan stared at her. His throat felt lined with dust. He had looked at her size and seen weakness. He had seen a liability. He hadn't seen the armor. He hadn't understood that the shallow, wheezing breath he had mocked was the mechanical reality of damaged lungs fighting a ribcage locked in a prison of scar tissue. Every breath she took in this thin mountain air was a conscious, agonizing effort. She wasn't weak. She was forged in a fire he couldn't even comprehend. "I can sleep in the barn," Sadie said, her voice dropping back to a rough whisper. "With the mule. I have blankets in my trunk. Tomorrow, when the weather breaks, you can drive me back down to Red Creek. I'll figure out the stagecoach fare." Harlan turned away. He walked to the wooden table, picked up the glass jar of cheap rye whiskey, and pulled the cork with his teeth. He grabbed a clean tin cup from the shelf, poured 2 fingers of the amber liquid, and walked back to the bed. He held the cup out to her. Sadie looked at the tin rim, then up at his weathered, bearded face. "Drink it," Harlan ordered. "It'll cut the chill." She reached out with a thick, trembling hand and took the cup. She drank it straight down. She coughed, a harsh, rattling sound, as the alcohol burned its way into her stomach. Harlan walked to the foot of the bed and grabbed the heavy, raw wool blankets. He pulled them back, exposing the lumpy feather ticking. "Take your boots off and get in," he said. Sadie hesitated, clutching the empty tin cup. "What about you?" "I ain't tired," Harlan lied. The exhaustion of the day was practically vibrating in his bones. But he walked over to the wooden crate he used as a second chair, dragged it across the rough floorboards, and planted it directly in front of the iron stove. "Fire needs feeding anyway. It's dropping to 10 below tonight." The night was a crucible of cold and waiting. Harlan sat on the crate, his forearms resting on his thighs, his missing finger throbbing with a dull, phantom ache, a reaction to the plummeting temperature. The wind battered the cabin, threatening to tear the cedar shakes from the roof. Behind him, the bed groaned in protest every time Sadie shifted, but the heavy timber frame held. Harlan listened to the sounds of her. The rustle of the wool, The sharp hitches in her breathing when she moved away that pulled at the rigid scars mapping her back. He fed the stove, pieces of split pine, strips of white birch bark that caught with a sharp hiss. The iron belly of the stove glowed a dull, angry cherry red, radiating a dry, localized heat that barely reached the corners of the room. He didn't sleep. He couldn't. His mind was a chaotic tangle of shame and revelation. He was a cynical man. He had fled the towns, fled the company of people, because he found them soft, treacherous, and shallow. He had bought a wife purely for utility, reducing a human being to a ledger of chores and warmth. When the carriage had opened in Red Creek, he had felt cheated. He had judged her entirely on the surface. He pulled his hunting knife from its sheath and absent-mindedly ran the whetstone down the edge, the rhythmic times, shh, times sound, cutting through the howl of the wind. He realized now that the mountain didn't just break the weak. Sometimes, the world down below did the breaking, and the survivors just needed a place where the noise stopped. Sadie had hauled a broken, heavy body up a freezing mountain road without a single complaint, knowing the man beside her despised her. She had sat in the freezing mud when she fell. She had offered to sleep in the snow with a mule. "I am a fool," Harlan thought, blowing a fine layer of metal dust from the blade of his knife. "A blind, bitter old fool." Around 3 in the morning, the temperature inside the cabin hit its lowest point. The moisture from their breath froze in crystalline patterns on the inside of the window panes. Harlan stood up, his joints popping loudly in the quiet room. He walked over to the bed. Sadie was asleep. She was curled on her side, a massive, imposing shape under the gray blankets. Her breathing had finally leveled out into a slow, labored rhythm. Her face, devoid of the nervous flush of the afternoon, looked pale and deeply lined in the dim light of the dying oil lamp. Harlan reached down and carefully pulled the heavy buffalo hide from the foot of the bed, dragging it up and over her shoulders, tucking the edge gently around her neck to block the draft. She stirred slightly, murmuring something incoherent, but didn't wake. Harlan went back to his crate. He watched the fire burn down to pulsing orange embers. Dawn broke not with sunlight, but with a gradual, bruised gray light that bled through the frosted glass. The wind finally died down, leaving behind a profound, ringing silence. Harlan was up. He had already broken the ice in the water bucket and had the coffee pot boiling on the flat top of the stove. The rich, bitter smell of chicory filled the small cabin, overpowering the stale scent of smoke and old wool. He heard the rustle of blankets behind him. Harlan didn't turn around immediately. He gave her time. He listened to the agonizing, slow process of Sadie forcing her stiff, ruined body upright. He heard the heavy thud of her boots hitting the floorboards, the sharp intake of breath as she forced her weight onto her legs. He deliberately kept his back turned, respecting the private, ugly dignity of her struggle. When the floorboards finally shrieked under her full weight, indicating she was standing, Harlan turned. He held 2 tin mugs of black, steaming coffee. He walked to the wooden table and set them down. Sadie stood by the bed, her heavy gray shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders. The exhaustion in her eyes was monumental, but there was something else there too, a wariness, a waiting. She looked from the coffee to Harlan. Harlan pulled out the wooden chair. He didn't offer any flowery apologies. He didn't offer pity. Neither of them had any use for it. "I'll need to widen the door frame on the outhouse," Harlan said flatly, pulling his own crate up to the table. "Wood's swollen from the wet, and the clearance is too narrow." Sadie stared at him. The silence stretched, heavy and profound, broken only by the bubbling of the coffee pot on the stove. She looked at his rough face, the graying beard, the missing finger on the hand resting near his mug. She recognized the peace offering for what it was, not romance, but practical, grounded acceptance. A tiny, almost imperceptible fraction of the tension drained from her massive shoulders. She walked slowly to the table. She looked at the fragile wooden chair, then back to him. "And I'll need a sturdier chair," she said, her voice raspy from the night air, "or I'm going to end up breaking this one into kindling." Harlan met her eyes. The corner of his mouth twitched, the ghost of a deeply buried smile. "I've got oak boards in the shed," Harlan said, taking a sip of his scalding coffee. "We'll build it after breakfast." Sadie sat down, carefully easing her weight onto the creaking wood. She wrapped her thick, scarred hands around the hot tin mug. They sat together in the gray morning light, two scarred, heavy souls at the edge of the world, drinking bitter coffee in the quiet, imperfect dawn. If this story of raw survival and unexpected connection struck a chord with you, please hit that like button and share it with someone who appreciates real, gritty storytelling. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more deeply human, unapologetic Western dramas. Your support helps us bring these rugged tales of the frontier to life. Leave a comment below. What would you have done in Harlan's boots? Thanks for listening, and we'll see you in the next one.